All right, thanks everyone. I was saying before, I'm after pizza this time. When I was here in 2019, I was before drinks, so I'll definitely take this trade. I think it's a much better time to talk. So, as the slide very much says, why security initiatives are doomed to fail and what you can do about it. Now, over the next half hour, what I'm more going to talk about is not how to do security, but more how to get security done. It's a bit of a nothing statement, but hopefully it makes a little bit more sense as we get into it. So, there's three key takeaways that hopefully you'll be able to take away from the next half hour, and if they don't make sense, hopefully they will by the end. The first is that understanding how work flows is fundamental. And this is how work flows through a business, through teams, all that kind of stuff. Understanding how work gets done and where it goes is fundamentally important. The second is Agile doesn't scale across teams. Those who know me know I rag on so much of Agile, especially scaled Agile all the time. Well, I'm going to talk about something that actually does work across teams and kind of look at why Agile really, when you look at security teams, Agile really doesn't seem to do much for you. It seems to just make everything a little bit harder than it was before, and you don't really get any advantages. And I'll talk about why, one of the reasons why that is. And the third one is you need to be constraint aware, and I will define what I mean by constraint and what I mean by constraint aware as we go along. The least important slide is the one about me. I'm a senior engagement partner at Cognizant Servian. I wrote the Cloud Native Security Cookbook with O'Reilly that came out last year to lukewarm applause. I'm also the one of the Perth organisers of BSides, which is Australia's biggest tech networking event, and we have the first one happening here in WA this year in mid-November. Free tickets are available now. You can find me on LinkedIn if you want to know more about that. So today I had way too much fun with Midjourney doing these slides, hence there's some ridiculous pictures all the way through it. We're going to talk about Fictitious Company, nice based in WA, Quokka Incorporated. I use them far too much. They're trying to digitally transform. If anyone has a good definition for that, can you let me know? The second thing is they're doing Agile, very much in inverted commas, and always will be. The security team is working harder than ever. I want to stress as I go through kind of what some of the problems are. It's not because people aren't trying hard enough. If anything, they're trying harder than ever. But security is struggling to keep pace with the fastest teams, and you're struggling to get movement from the slowest teams. This is really common where across a large enough company, you've got the teams that are moving at the speed of light, and you've got the teams that are barely moving at all. And this is just because this is what I run into on a daily basis and have for a few years now. They implemented a new CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management, 6 months ago, and they thought that was going to solve all their problems. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Okay, so this is pretty standard. This is what I see a lot of the time in terms of controls, that the amount of controls they have in the CSPM keeps going up. That sounds good, right? They can see more of what's happening. That's good. The problem is they've got violations are increasing at a faster rate than they're adding new controls. And the average age of a violation is increasing. Now, I can't remember the last time I went to a client and I didn't see this. Maybe that's because I work with particular kinds of businesses, but this is so common, it's a trope. When we look at the security posture, really it's eroding over time. And I know I picked on cloud security here because that's what I generally do, but you can apply this to any kind of security, really. Defining problems faster than we can fix them. It's forcing them into this reactive of a proactive approach. It's about, oh, something bad happened, we need to go and fix that right now. You can see from the numbers that the derivative of the security posture is going in the wrong direction. I'm going to talk far too much about value streams. For those who haven't come across them before, a value stream pretty much is the mapping of the process from please to thank you. So from idea to, and ideally in the hands of a customer. When you look at them, they can either be owned by one team or they can be split across them. That's a key point I will harp back on at length. When you look at value stream metrics, and I've gone the simplest possible, I remember this from looking at DevOps back in early 2010s, and they said this is how everyone delivers software. But this is kind of very, very, very simplified value stream for any kind of development team. They do development, they do build, they do testing, and they deploy it. When you look at a value stream, there's many metrics you can look at, and I'm only going to look at two today. The first is throughput, which is the unit delivered per unit time. And the second is the lead time, which is the average time for a unit to be delivered. As I said, there's many more metrics, but those two are probably the most important two, and the two I kind of need to make my point. You can think of an organization as being made up of value streams. That's effectively the way they deliver value to customers, whether that's internal, external, or what have you. But there's kind of important ways to look at things. Now, when you look at the value stream of a product team or kind of development team, ideally, and yeah, there are caveats on this, but they generally own their value stream end to end. This is generally what the DevOps movement was trying to do, despite what's happened to it in the intervening years. The point with this is everything's in their sphere of control. The development team owns everything they have to do. They don't have to rely on anyone else. They don't get blocked on other teams. They're not waiting on other teams. Admittedly, your mileage may vary, but this is kind of where things are going, where things hopefully are. And this is, to date, the most effective way of delivering customer value we've found, is to bring together cross-functional teams to go and do the thing. So a slight sideways movement into the theory of constraints from Eli Goldratt. So people may have come across this before. I'm going to do a very, very light treatment on it. But in terms of relations to value streams, there is actually one constraint on a value stream. There is one thing that is defining what the throughput of value stream can possibly be. And anytime you invest effort into improving something that isn't the constraint, you are wasting your time. You're just kind of making more work that just sits at the constraint, not really getting worked on. The classic example I see in development teams is testing. You have developers, they go hit features, and there's a manual testing team that they have to wait 2 weeks for them to be around, and then they run testing that takes 2 weeks. So although you can make the devs code faster, it doesn't actually matter because it's the testing bit that defines how quickly you can go. So just following on from that, and I mean, I don't have enough time to go into this level of detail I'd ideally like to, but we want to keep the constraint optimally fed. Ideally, wherever that constraint is in your process, you want to make sure it's always working, but it never has too much work. So anytime your constraint doesn't have work to do, you're actually just losing value. You're wasting your time because it should be working. And at the same time, you don't want to overload the constraint because then there's too much to do. They have to multitask, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But in terms of all of a sudden having to prioritize 10 different things, nothing really gets worked on, and everything starts to fall apart. So for a security team, the value stream you're trying to execute on spans teams. It's very rare a security team can execute stuff in isolation. Normally, and I was saying this to some guys outside, that developers are the source and solution to all security problems. They create them, but they're also the way to fix them. The thing is that your work generally enters a sphere of influence here. You're no longer in control of the work, you're just influencing how the work is getting done. The constraint is almost certainly outside of the security team. So the moment you can optimize what you're doing, doesn't actually matter. Instead, I'm going to prove this with some simple modeling in a bit. So being that this is the case, where your security team, you have to get product teams to do things, eventually the work kind of comes back to you for trust and verify. You need to understand how to optimize when this is the way you're going to work. When you look at Agile, they go back to that kind of team owns everything, we're just going to optimize on that. They randomly end up approximating theory of constraints-based view on that, but it's kind of by chance, not by design. So just to quickly walk through like what an infrastructure configuration change might look like, we've got a security team. There are 3 product teams that are independent, and then comes back to the security team at the end. And I put indicative lead times on all of them. So remembering lead time was the average time for something to get actioned and completed by a certain team. Now I'm going to use a variety of colors to show, and why the colors are there will make more sense in a second, but to show colors in terms of all these changes that impact every single team. So the security team's going to pick something up, and for every piece of work, they're going to need each product team to do something. And then ideally, it gets the security team at the end and we'll do stuff. And we'll just kind of model what happens after like 5 weeks of work. So after the first week, the security team's done what they need to do. They've now passed it off to the 3 product teams. After 2 weeks, again, the security team's able to chunk through work, feed it to the other teams. You can already see there's a bit of a backlog happening on 2 of the other teams. Effectively, as you step through, it takes us actually 5 weeks to get any work completed, any work actually signed off, because it had to go all 3 product teams to get there. We have a variety of backlogs sitting in front of teams of work to be done. And you will notice that for product team 3, that backlog is actually measured. The top one is slightly in progress. So it's actually 8 weeks worth of work they have to do. So that means product team 3 is your constraint. That's the simplest way to find the constraint. There is a lot more you can do on this, and there are other, not going to go into it, don't have time. Anyway, so product team 3 is your constraint. So at the moment, they are defining how much work actually comes out of the security team because they're the slowest moving part. So yeah, But finding constraint for a given backlog of work, the team with the longest queue in time is your constraint. Not necessarily the most they have to do, but when you take the amount they have to do times by the time it's going to take them to do it, that biggest number, that is a team that's your constraint. Multitasking is a myth. I argue with my wife on this all the time. She reckons she can do a million things at once. It gets annoyed at me for only doing one, but the psychology and all the research backs me up on this one. When you get to constraints, task switching, debating priorities, those are both inherently wasteful things. If you're, there's context residue that happens when your attention residue that happens when you switch between different things. When you have, if any of you worked in like an environment that's scaled agile or anything else like PI planning, where you spend 2 days arguing what you're doing for the next 2 months, or even on the Scrum level where you're spending, generally maybe a day doing backlog grooming, you're arguing on these priorities all the time. Ideally, you don't have to do that, right? That's all wasteful time. You're not actually adding value or trying to find value in there. When you have these constraints and you have a team, I've got these 10 different security holes I need you to fix. I'm like, well, which one's the most important? There's all waste, right? What you want to do is release work as a constraint becomes available. You kind of want, you've got time to work on this, here's the next piece. Time to work on this, here's the next piece. You're not going to try and introduce multitasking into a system where you've got where the constraint is, because you're just going to waste time. Waste time. The performance of the constraint actually goes down the more work you give it. A little bit on queuing theory, because I can't help myself, but Little's law, the length of a queue is arrival time by the processing time. So yeah, effectively, the bigger the backlog, the longer the lead time. So when you go back to that model before, we had product team 3 that had 8 weeks of work ahead of them. The next thing you add is going to add another 3 weeks to that, right? So you're starting to lose this idea of agility because you've already given them other stuff to work on. You just give them more, and it's like, well, now that's 2 months away, guys. That's 3 months. That's 6 months. This is where you get to the point where all of a sudden, when I work in enterprise, I need this simple change. Cool, that's 3 months away. But it takes 5 minutes. Yeah, I know, but it's going to take 3 months because we can't get to it till then. So let's look at a slightly different model where we're trying to think about what our constraint is. Here, so you'll notice in the middle with the product teams, the colors have changed slightly. So product team 3 only works on white and red. The product team 2 works on all colors, and product team 3 works on what ended up being the French flag, not by any means or design, just worked out that way. But effectively, what we're trying to do is look at, well, actually, if we try and pick work that fits around our constraint, can we actually just get more done? So if, again, we model after 1 week, after 2 weeks, after 3 weeks, we've actually got work done faster than we did before because it's actually flowed through the system. But at the end of 5 weeks, we've got 2 pieces of work. Now, that doesn't sound superly impressive, but bearing in mind on the early model, we only had 1. If we extrapolate this out to 12 weeks, the difference starts to become quite stark. That in the constraint naive mode, where we were just throwing work at the system that everyone had to do, we only got 3 things done. And the average lead time of any piece of work was 4 weeks. If we go to this constraint aware, we're actually stylizing the work we're doing based on the idea we know where the constraint is. We've got the same 3 items done, plus an extra 4, and our lead time for actual making improvements has gone down to 1.7 weeks on average. This is just like a step change in difference. And no one worked any harder. This wasn't harder, this was just working smarter, right? By just modeling this way, by looking at, and I'll get into, I understand the model was simple, right? And it's not as if it's quite that simple, like everyone has a number there, and I'll get into that in a bit. But you can just see by thinking this way, you're actually changing the way you're approaching the work relative to the system you're working within. Not just kind of throwing stuff on like, this is the most priority. Well, actually, is it, when you actually understand things a little bit better? So a little bit of agile planning, or professional fortune telling, as I like to think of it. So the most common one you'll see is called WSGF, or weighted shortest job first, which comes down to theoretically simple formula of cost of delay over job size, which you can kind of go value over effort. A little bit more nuance to it, but not for now. This works okay in single team scenarios. I'll come back to that product team that was kind of owning everything end to end. This kind of works. Planning poker aside, which is horrific, but it generally works. When you're doing this in the multi-team scenario, job size, this isn't quite so simple anymore. Because if you look at the constraint aware here, the constraint aware here, and the constraint aware here, has job size really necessarily changed that much? From the team, from the security perspective, they have 2 weeks of work to do on each of these job items. What this really means is job size is impact to the constraint. It's not actually amount of time it takes to get the work done in its entirety. It's purely the impact of that piece of work at the constraint of the system. All the other work doesn't actually mean anything because the constraint is what's actually focusing the throughput in here. Again, I don't have time to kind of model this to the level where you're going to have to take me on face value. I apologize. Anyway, the constraint is outside the team. So as much as within a security team you go, oh, we'll work harder, we'll work harder, we'll work harder, it's not actually going to make any difference. Because really the thing that's going to make the difference is by, focusing on how you're going to fit the work, fit your system, or try and change the system. And I don't have time to get into how you change the system here. But what we did, the change that I made in the constraint aware point is I actually started putting work in that was outside, away from the constraint, had no impact on the constraint at all. It was free, effectively, in the system. So that's why we got all the same work done, but also extra bits, because we actually moved stuff away from the constraint here. Bearing in mind, the constraint can move. The kind of default thing is you'll see product team 3-week lead time. Oh, they've got to be the constraint, right? Well, if you actually have the backlog on the left, actually the 1 week lead time, the fastest team actually becomes a constraint because they have the most work to do. There is 5 weeks of work for them to do. There's 3 for product team 3 and 2 for product team 1. So the constraint can move. And again, I don't have time to get into kind of all the modeling you need to do. I'm trying to sell the point as opposed to selling the solution. Facing predictability. So this is probably, what I'm going to go through is what I think is probably the easiest and best bang for buck change or debate you can have from security into development kind of in the next week. So when you're looking for predictability, you want a stable system. What do I mean by stable? The system I showed you was stable. Those lead times, they don't change. I kind of went, it's going to be 3 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks every time. Simple. As we all know, security works get constantly deprioritized because everyone gets feature factored into oblivion, right? So when this happens, you start to see like this. So product team 1, it's 2 to 5 weeks. Product team 2, it's 1 to 3 weeks. Product team 3, it's 3 to 9 weeks. This system is inherently unstable now. So when you're trying to actually plan out how you're going to plan your workload, yeah, good luck with that. You've got no idea what's actually going to happen on these because you may give stuff, do you take the averages of these? Is that representative? Do you take worst case? Do you take best case? How do you actually do it on this? You actually can't because it just varies. And you'll plan your workout, you'll have it, this is going to be amazing. These start to go a little bit volatile and all of a sudden everything falls apart in a heap and you've lost time. The best thing you can do is steal from the Project to Product book by Dr. Mick Kirsten, who talks about the flow framework in general, but just going to talk about one piece, which is flow distribution. And again, if people know me, I'm sorry I'm bringing this up again. I have a bad habit. But effectively, this is consulting, so consulting friendly for, hey, we've got 4 buckets and all work goes into it. It's amazing, right? So you can look at all work a team will do in terms of a product team by four different things. You've got features, risks, defects, and debt. Kind of the most important thing here is each of those buckets is under the single control of a single stakeholder. So feature, your product owner is going to say, hey, these are the features you need to do. Defects going to cover me customers complaining about things or customer support. Risk is going to be security, potentially governance, but kind of one part of the business trying to manage risk are going to define what goes in there. And debt comes from the team, and this is where you get the developers on board and go, we're going to build tech debt time resolution into how you work. And they're all going to jump for joy because that's all they ever wanted in life. But effectively, it's this important thing about the risk bucket being singly prioritized by security. Because now you don't have to argue with everyone, potentially, for how your stuff gets prioritized. And I've got a Tim Ferriss paraphrasing quote here. What's the one decision I can make that prevents the next 100? If you can get this kind of model in, I'm going to go one more level on it in a second. You get that in place, you stop having to debate with every product team how your work fits into their prioritization scheme. Because what you've done is you defined a model up front, and what you end up doing is you go, okay, and it doesn't have to be 20%, you just need numbers here. So we're going to go with every iteration, whether that's a sprint, whether that's Kanban measured over a period of time, whether that's PI, like product increment, however you do your iteration planning, actually we're going to spend 20% of our time on risk security work. So what we're going to do, that's negotiated up front. As the product team, I don't decide what goes in that bucket. So risk decide what goes in that bucket and the relative priorities of those. So I will just pick off the top and work on that as it goes. So all of a sudden, you don't have to argue why making, configuration change for the next 3 buckets is important. I don't really care. I don't have to know. What you've said is that's the most important thing for me to work on, and we'll pull that in and do that. And you do the same for debt as well. The idea is that the risk and debt buckets get filled up first, and then you put features and defects on top. This is how you take like a product-centric mindset to it. This is how you look after things over the long haul, so stuff doesn't start to fall apart over time. And the allocations, you use it or lose it, right? If security can't get enough work to fill the 20% to you for that iteration, fantastic. That spare capacity goes into features. So it makes this dynamic where security is incentivized to fill those buckets, but now we don't have to argue about it. We just have to put it there and then you'll work on it. That's so much better, right? This is where I kind of come back all the way to the start where I was talking about there's a focus on controls, on detective controls over actually fixing things. The security posture was getting worse, but we're able to understand it was getting worse better. That's not really a value in isolation, right? The problem, and this is just kind of basic psychology, is you'll naturally gravitate towards the easy work over the hard work. Deploying new detective controls is something you own, you deliver, you do by yourself. Trying to get devs to do things, very frustratingly hard and difficult. You're naturally going to tend away from this, right? You want to focus on value over points, and yeah, I just have to bash story pointing every slide deck. I can't help myself. You want to focus on what the value of this is. More detective controls is not going to give value in and of themselves, because you need the corrective controls as well. You need to actually go and fix things or prevent things. So you can make the harder easier. So you can do kind of what I've been suggesting through all of this, where you actually go through and look at the corrective controls and look at how do we get the correction work happening to best fit the system that you can go along with. That's ideal bit, is making it harder easier. But I come back to this analogy of, it's from a American professor where he's talking, it had like a jar and it's filling up with rocks and then pebbles and then sand and then water, right? And then he asks everyone at the end, like, why do we do that? It's like, oh, well, then you were able to fill it up. There's like, why did I do it in that order? If I filled it with sand first, I can't get the big rocks in anymore. About focusing on what are the big things you need to do to drive the impact, and you fill in around that. You don't just fill with the easy stuff and go, hey, we're doing amazing because we're getting so much done. Yeah, but is it really driving the value you're trying to get to? Like really, these are the bits that are important. The top one of the CS control, that's more a vanity metric than anything. It doesn't actually really mean anything in isolation. The problem, or your North Star, is more around the violations and the age of the violations. You've got more problems and they're living for continually longer. Those are bad things. That's what you need to go after. If your work isn't helping attack those, you really need to be debating about whether that's the work you should be doing. So after all of that, I've gone to, well, some level of detail on all of that, just to kind of look at, can we do something else? That sounds like a lot of work, right? Of modeling and trying to figure out everything's going on. Now, not everyone should be Google. I'm going to caveat with that. Google have what they call large-scale changes, and I'm going to link the book that talks about this in the most depth at the end. There's 3 books at the end, because, again, I can't help myself. So what they've tried to do, with lots of that removed, multi-team value streams here, they've got it where the accountability for the service and the service health, that still belongs to the product team / SRE. That doesn't belong to security. However, security teams can actually make changes autonomously. So, we had the guys giving a great talk about SBOM earlier and that kind of stuff. For the way Google work, and they have a whole bunch of stuff around this that wraps it up that makes it possible. But effectively, if they have a vulnerable dependency, security can go and change that, and it will automatically proliferate out to all their services and systems. They don't have to go and get the product team to actually do it. But if something breaks in production, that's not the security person's fault for breaking it. It's the product team's testing and quality engineering wasn't actually good enough to allow it. It should have been caught on the way. It's not security's problem, it's the product team's problem. They need to go and fix it. But it actually enables security to actually go and do things, so you can get away from this whole multi-team problem, because you're actually operating within yourselves again. The problem is that you need kind of world-leading development operations to make this happen, and quality engineering and all this kind of stuff, right? I like to put this in as kind of like what's the actual zenith of where you could be versus what's actually realistic to do now. The stuff I talked about today is stuff you can start looking at now, especially flow distribution. I have kind of a long list of clients I've introduced out over the years, because I do it every single time, because I get in and there's a giant backlog that's measured in years. I remember one I joined, and like the Monte Carlo simulation of the backlog was 5 years. I'm like, okay, we're going to kill everything here, and we're going to start again, and we're going to look at it with much more kind of rigor around it, right? Getting on the backlog doesn't mean anything. absolutely means nothing. Only it's an option that you've yet to exercise. You exercise the option as soon as you pull it into work. So, the easiest thing in the world is go, oh yeah, it's on the backlog. When someone, oh, can you do this? Yeah, it's on the backlog. Doesn't actually mean anything at all, right? Because it doesn't mean it'll ever get worked on. It just means they made a note of it. Fantastic, right? So I'm going to circle back around. I'm actually running a little bit ahead of time, so there might be time for a couple of questions if people have them. But just come right back around. So understanding how work flows is fundamental. This is what I'm talking about, this multi-team scenario, is understanding how security is done is arguably more important than how to do security. Because all you can do is optimize kind of how do you do security, but if you understand how work actually gets done, you're going to optimize the wrong thing. You're going to local optimize over global optimize, and you're going to end up in a worse problem than if you did nothing at all. Agile doesn't scale across teams. The notion of planning and everything else and trying to look at things in isolation the way Agile really doesn't really go to scale to multi-team scenarios. I was thinking about it earlier that if people have been worked in SAFe and you have Agile release trains, I'm pretty convinced that's someone trying to introduce the trolley problem into Agile, where you're just like, how can we actually take out as many teams at once by bringing them all together? And the third one is you need to constraint aware. So you need to start thinking about how your work is done, how it impacts constraints, where your constraint is based on the work you're trying to do. And then there's a whole lot of stuff you can do after that, which I do not have time. I haven't got time to help you fix the problems, just maybe give you a little bit of a heuristic to where they actually are. If you're more interested in the theory of constraint stuff, standing on bits, you can get on LeanPub, it's fantastic. If the value streaming stuff was interesting, project to product is a great place to start. If how Google do it with large scale changes, interesting, software engineering at Google is a great resource as well. But yeah, for more kind of reading, or if you've read those and you want something else to go in more detail, believe me, I have more. But those are the best places to get started. But that's all I have.